Cornell Law School, UCC, Article 2, Sales, Part 5, Performance. Paragraph 2501. Insurable interest in goods. Manner of identification of goods. 1. The buyer obtains a special property and an insurable interest in goods by identification of existing goods as goods to which the contract refers, even though the goods so identified are non-conforming and he has an option to return or reject them. Such identification can be made at any time and in any manner explicitly agreed to by the parties. In the absence of explicit agreement, identification occurs: A. When the contract is made, if it is for the sale of goods already existing and identified. B. If the contract is for the sale of future goods other than those described in paragraph C. When goods are shipped, marked or otherwise designated by the seller as goods to which the contract refers. C. When the crops are planted or otherwise become growing crops or the young are conceived, if the contract is for the sale of unborn young to be born within 12 months after contracting, or for the sale of crops to be harvested within 12 months or the next normal harvest season after contracting, whichever is longer. 2. The seller retains an insurable interest in goods so long as title to or any security interest in the goods remains in him, and where the identification is by the seller alone, he may, until default or insolvency or notification to the buyer that the identification is final, substitute other goods for those identified. 3. Nothing in this section impairs any insurable interest recognized under any other statute or rule of law. Paragraph 2502. Buyer's right to goods on seller's insolvency. Primary tabs. 1. Subject to subsection 2. And even though the goods have not been shipped, a buyer who has paid a part or all of the price of goods in which he has a special property under the provisions of the immediately preceding section may, on making and keeping good a tender of any unpaid portion of their price, recover them from the seller, if the seller becomes insolvent within 10 days after receipt of the first installment on their price. 2. If the identification creating his special property has been made by the buyer, he acquires the right to recover the goods only if they conform to the contract for sale. Paragraph 2503. Manner of seller's tender of delivery. 1. Tender of delivery requires that the seller put and hold conforming goods at the buyer's disposition and give the buyer any notification reasonably necessary to enable him to take delivery. The manner, time and place for tender are determined by the agreement and this article, and in particular, A. Tender must be at a reasonable hour, and if it is of goods, they must be kept available for the period reasonably necessary to enable the buyer to take possession, but B. Unless otherwise agreed, the buyer must furnish facilities reasonably suited to the receipt of the goods. 2. Where the case is within the next section respecting shipment, tender requires that the seller comply with its provisions. 3. Where the seller is required to deliver at a particular destination, tender requires that he comply with subsection 1, and also in any appropriate case tender documents as described in subsections 4 and 5 of this section. 4. Where goods are in the possession of a bailee and are to be delivered without being moved, A. Tender requires that the seller either tender a negotiable document of title covering such goods or procure acknowledgement by the bailee of the buyer's right to possession of the goods, but B. Tender to the buyer of a non-negotiable document of title or of a written direction to the bailee to deliver a sufficient tender unless the buyer seasonably objects, and receipt by the bailee of notification of the buyer's rights fixes those rights as against the bailee and all third persons, but risk of loss of the goods and of any failure by the bailee to honor the non-negotiable document of title or to obey the direction remains on the seller until the buyer has had a reasonable time to present the document or direction, and a refusal by the bailee to honor the document or to obey the direction defeats the tender. 5. Where the contract requires the seller to deliver documents, A. He must tender all such documents in correct form, except as provided in this article with respect to bills of lading in a set subsection 2 of section 2323, and B. Tender through customary banking channels is sufficient, and dishonor of a draft accompanying the documents constitutes non-acceptance or rejection. Paragraph 2504. Shipment by seller. Where the seller is required or authorized to send the goods to the buyer and the contract does not require him to deliver them at a particular destination, then unless otherwise agreed he must a. put the goods in the possession of such a carrier and make such a contract for their transportation as may be reasonable having regard to the nature of the goods and other circumstances of the case, and b. obtain and promptly deliver or tender in due form any document necessary to enable the buyer to obtain possession of the goods or otherwise required by the agreement or by usage of trade, and c. promptly notify the buyer of the shipment. Failure to notify the buyer under paragraph C or to make a proper contract under paragraph A is a ground for rejection only if material delay or loss ensues. Paragraph 2505. Seller's shipment under reservation. 1. Where the seller has identified goods to the contract by or before shipment, a. is procurement of a negotiable bill of lading to his own order or otherwise reserves in him a security interest in the goods. His procurement of the bill to the order of a financing agency or of the buyer indicates in addition only the seller's expectation of transferring that interest to the person named. b. A non-negotiable bill of lading to himself or his nominee reserves possession of the goods as security, but except in a case of conditional delivery, subsection 2 of section 2507, a non-negotiable bill of lading naming the buyer as consignee reserves no security interest even though the seller retains possession of the bill of lading. 2. When shipment by the seller with reservation of a security interest is in violation of the contract for sale, it constitutes an improper contract for transportation within the preceding section, but impairs neither the rights given to the buyer by shipment and identification of the goods to the contract nor the seller's powers as a holder of a negotiable document. Paragraph 2506. Rights of financing agency. 1. A financing agency by paying or purchasing for value a draft which relates to a shipment of goods acquires to the extent of the payment or purchase and in addition to its own rights under the draft and any document of title securing it any rights of the shipper and the goods including the right to stop delivery and the shipper's right to have the draft honored by the buyer. 2. The right to reimbursement of a financing agency which has in good faith honored or purchased the draft under commitment to or authority from the buyer is not impaired by subsequent discovery of defects with reference to any relevant document which was apparently regular on its face. Paragraph 2507. Effect of seller's tender. Delivery on condition. 1. Tender of delivery is a condition to the buyer's duty to accept the goods and, unless otherwise agreed, to his duty to pay for them. Tender entitles the seller to acceptance of the goods and to payment according to the contract. 2. Where payment is due and demanded on the delivery to the buyer of goods or documents of title, his right as against the seller to retain or dispose of them is conditional upon his making the payment due. Paragraph 2508. Cure by seller of improper tender or delivery. Replacement. 1. Where any tender or delivery by the seller is rejected because non-conforming and the time for performance has not yet expired, the seller may seasonably notify the buyer of his intention to cure and may then within the contract time make a conforming delivery. 2. Where the buyer rejects a non-conforming tender which the seller had reasonable grounds to believe would be acceptable with or without money allowance, the seller may, if he seasonably notifies the buyer, have a further reasonable time to substitute a conforming tender.